They didn't just conquer a city. They erased it. In one morning, a medieval army broke through a gate and turned streets into a weapon. Men, women, children, no trials, no mercy, no difference. And somewhere in the chaos, a single sentence was whispered that would haunt Europe for centuries. This is the story behind the Massacre of Béziers, one of the most terrifying slaughters in medieval Europe. Not as a legend, not as a sermon, but as a calculated message. A warning written in fire, meant to make entire kingdoms obey. Southern France in the early 1200s didn't feel like France. It felt like another world. The north spoke the language of kings and crusades. The south, Occitania, spoke the language of troubadours, trade, and dangerous ideas. Its towns were rich. Its nobles were independent. Its culture was elegant. And its faith was complicated. Because in the hills and cities of the Languedoc, a movement had taken root that Rome could not control. They called them Cathars. To the Catholic Church, they were heretics. To many locals, they were neighbors, healers, preachers who lived simply while bishops lived like princes. Cathar belief threatened the church at the deepest level. Not with swords. With refusal. They rejected the authority of Rome. Questioned the sacraments. Denied that the material world, flesh, wealth, even the church's splendor, could ever be holy. To the Vatican, it wasn't just a spiritual dispute. It was an existential threat. If people could choose a different truth, the entire medieval order could crack. At the center of this tension stood a young lord with a dangerous problem. Raymond-Roger Trencavel. He wasn't a king. That made him more frightening. He was a viscount, ruler of a chain of powerful strongholds, Carcassonne, Béziers, and the lands in between. His family name carried weight. His castles commanded trade routes. His authority was close enough to touch, close enough to resist the church without openly defying it. Raymond-Roger was young, charismatic, and politically trapped. His people included Catholics and Cathars, and families intertwined between both. If he persecuted the Cathars, he would rip his own lands apart. If he protected them, Rome would call him an enemy of God. History remembers him because his dilemma wasn't personal. It was a preview of what was coming to Europe. Because when the church couldn't persuade the south, it decided to conquer it. In 1208, a papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau, was murdered. The killer's true ties were murky, but blame landed where Rome wanted it to land, on the southern nobility. Pope Innocent III seized the moment. A crusade was declared. Not against Muslims in distant deserts. Against Christians at home. Northern knights answered for salvation. And for land. Imagine the offer. Fight in the name of God, and keep whatever you take. Among the Crusade's leaders was a hard man with a holy title, Arnaud Amalric, the Pope's legate. And among the warriors who would rise from the blood was a noble who wanted more than forgiveness, Simon de Montfort. Their target was not just belief. It was an entire culture. An independent South. A different Europe. And the first city on the path, standing like a locked door, was Béziers. A city tied to Raymond-Roger Trencavel's world. A city that would become a stage. Not for battle. For terror. Raymond-Roger Trencavel inherited power too young. He grew up surrounded by stone walls and whispered alliances. He learned early that swords were only half the battlefield. The other half was loyalty. And in Occitania, loyalty was never simple. His lands were a patchwork. Castles on ridges. Markets along rivers. Cities whose merchants could fund armies. Villages whose fields fed them. Carcassonne, his jewel, rose like a crown of rock and towers. Béziers, wealthy and proud, pulsed with trade and wine. Albi watched the countryside like a fortress with a church's shadow stretched long. He wasn't just governing. He was balancing. Northern lords ruled by intimidation. Raymond-Roger ruled by negotiation, oaths, and local custom. He held court where poets were welcomed and disputes were settled with words before blood. That image, civilized, tolerant, modern for its time, made him admired. It also made him suspect. Because the church measured obedience differently. Not by how well you ruled. By how completely you submitted. And Raymond-Roger did not submit. He didn't declare himself Cathar. He didn't preach against Rome. He did something worse. He allowed choice. Cathars lived under his protection because they lived under his law. Some were even from families with influence. Artisans. Merchants. People who mattered. To remove them would spark rebellion and economic collapse. And Raymond-Roger understood something many rulers pretend not to understand. If you set fire to your own house to prove you're loyal to someone else, you still end up homeless. So he walked a narrow line. He met with church officials.
He promised order.
He avoided direct confrontation.
He tried to keep the peace.
But peace can look like weakness to men who profit from war. In Rome, Pope Innocent III watched the South like a surgeon watches infection.
He tried preaching first.
He sent missionaries.
He sent envoys. Then he sent threats.
Raymond-Roger's name began to appear in letters and accusations. A protector of heresy. A lord too comfortable with disobedience. A ruler who needed correction. And while the Pope's ink dried, the North sharpened steel. Knights from distant counties rode south, drawn by a promise that sounded like heaven and tasted like land. They marched behind crosses stitched onto their clothing. But the calculations underneath were cold. If the South was condemned, its castles could be inherited by the faithful. If its lords were labeled heretics, their titles could be stripped. If its cities resisted, their wealth could be seized. Raymond-Roger heard the rumors like thunder beyond the horizon. The crusade was forming. The storm was real. And still, he tried to do what rulers do when they sense disaster.
He tried to negotiate. He traveled.
He met with legates. He made limited promises. He swore oaths that bought time. He hoped the crusade would target someone else first. But crusades do not drift. They lock onto a target. The murder of the papal legate in 1208 turned political tension into holy permission. Now the crusade had a story.
A martyr. A banner.
The South's great noble, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, was forced into humiliating penance.
Public shame.
Submission rituals. A noble reduced to a symbol. It was a warning meant for everyone. Especially Raymond-Roger. Because if Toulouse could be broken, so could Carcassonne.
So could Béziers.
Raymond-Roger's power was real. But it depended on something the crusade didn't respect.
Consent.
His people followed him because he was their lord, yes. But also because he was their shield against outsiders. And in 1209, outsiders were coming in numbers that made shields feel small. Tens of thousands moved south, some knights, many foot soldiers, and endless hangers-on.
Not just an army. A migrating machine.
When they reached the edge of Occitania, the message was clear.
Submit.
Deliver the heretics.
Open your gates. Or become an example.
Raymond-Roger understood what example meant.
Not defeat. Demonstration.
He looked at his lands, at his cities, at his people. He looked at the crusade rolling toward Béziers. And he realized something terrifying.
This wasn't a war to win.
It was a punishment to survive. Béziers was not the strongest fortress in the south. It didn't need to be.
It was proud. It was crowded.
It was wealthy. And it believed fatally that it could not be touched.
The city had walls.
It had militia. It had confidence built from years of being important. And when the Crusaders arrived in July 1209, Béziers didn't see saints. It saw invaders. The crusade demanded a simple act: surrender the Cathars inside.
Hand them over. Prove loyalty to Rome.
But the Cathars weren't a separate tribe hiding in caves. They were woven into the city. How do you hand over people who are your customers, your cousins, your neighbors? How do you pull them from their homes without tearing your own identity apart? So Béziers refused. Not because every citizen was Cathar, but because the demand itself felt like a knife held to the throat of the city's dignity. The Crusade's leaders were ready for resistance. They had prepared sermons for it. They had prepared punishments for it. But they hadn't prepared for how quickly violence could slip its leash. The night before the massacre, the Crusader camp sprawled outside the walls.
Tents. Torches.
Prayers murmured beside sharpened blades. Inside Béziers, fear moved like a draft through alleyways. Some people wanted to negotiate.
Some wanted to fight.
Some wanted to flee.
Many couldn't. The gates stayed closed.
Raymond-Roger Trencavel was not inside Béziers when the Crusaders came. He was in Carcassonne, watching the enemy approach his world. But Béziers was part of his sphere. Its fate would become his fate. Because this crusade wasn't only about religious purity. It was about ownership. And ownership required a spectacle.
At dawn, tension snapped. Accounts differ on the spark. A skirmish.
A sortie from the city's defenders. A clash near the gate.
Then a mistake. A moment. A gap.
A gate opened, or was forced, or was left vulnerable in the chaos. And the Crusader army poured in. Not in orderly ranks.
Not in noble formation. In a surge.
A flood of men who had been promised salvation and spoils. A flood that didn't care who was Cathar or Catholic. A flood that had waited too long to be restrained. The city's defenders were overwhelmed almost instantly. Militia against crusaders is not a duel. It's a collapse. Béziers became a maze of terror. People ran toward churches, believing stone and sanctuary could slow the end. They ran toward homes. They ran toward anywhere that felt like inside, away from the screaming outside. But the invaders were already inside. And in the crusader leadership, the argument that mattered most arrived too late. How do we separate heretic from faithful? The question itself revealed the truth. They could not. Not in a city of thousands. Not in the frenzy of conquest. Not with soldiers drunk on permission. And this is where the story turns colder. Because even if the famous line was embroidered by later writers, even if it was repeated because it sounded too perfect to waste, its meaning matched the moment with horrifying precision. Kill them all. God will know his own. Whether spoken or not, that idea ruled Béziers that morning. No sorting. No mercy courts. No careful theology. Just annihilation as policy. When the smoke lifted, Béziers was no longer a proud city refusing demands. It was a lesson. And lessons travel faster than armies. News ran through the south ahead of the crusade like a plague. Béziers had been destroyed. Not defeated. Destroyed. Cities that had been considering resistance began to reconsider breathing. Lords who had been confident began to bargain. Not for victory. For survival. Raymond-Roger felt the walls closing in around Carcassonne, even before the first siege tower rolled into view. The crusade had shown its face. Not justice. Not conversion. Terror as governance. Now came the betrayal, quiet, practical, and deadly. Southern nobles began to calculate. If Béziers could be erased, who would defend Carcassonne when it was their turn? How many allies would stand beside a young viscount against a crusade blessed by the Pope? Some wrote letters of submission. Some offered hostages. Some simply disappeared into neutrality, the coward's safest armor. And the crusade's leaders knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't only taking cities. They were breaking the trust between them. They were isolating Raymond-Roger, one frightened neighbor at a time. Carcassonne became crowded with refugees from Béziers. People with hollow eyes, carrying stories too violent to repeat without shaking. They brought more than fear. They brought proof. And proof changes everything. Raymond-Roger's advisors urged him to flee. Ride to Aragon. Seek help. Live to fight later. But leaving meant surrendering his people. And Raymond-Roger had built his rule on being the shield. He stayed. He sent messages. He asked for support. He tried to pull allies back from panic. But panic is a stronger lord than any viscount. The crusade marched to Carcassonne with a new aura. Not just an army. An inevitability. And Raymond-Roger, young, stubborn, and running out of time, made the decision that would seal his fate. He chose to negotiate face-to-face with the men who had just turned Béziers into ash. Carcassonne was built to resist. Double walls. Towers. Stone designed to outlast men. But sieges don't only attack walls. They attack lungs. They attack thirst. They attack time. When the crusaders surrounded Carcassonne, summer heat turned the air into punishment. The countryside around the city became hostile ground. Water sources were contested. Supply lines were threatened. Inside the walls, refugees from Béziers filled the streets. Not soldiers. Families. They had fled one horror and walked directly into the next. Carcassonne became a trapped heart, beating too fast. Raymond-Roger moved through the city like a man carrying a secret he could not say out loud. Even strong walls can become a coffin if the air inside runs out. Days passed. Skirmishes flared. The crusader camp tightened like a noose. And the crusade offered terms. Not peace. Terms. Negotiation in medieval war often looked civilized. Flags of truce. Formal meetings. Oaths. But those rituals only work when both sides believe in the same rules. Raymond-Roger believed, because he had to, that noble customs would protect him if he met the enemy leadership under truce. That a viscount could speak to counts and legates and not be treated like prey. He entered the crusader camp to negotiate. And the ground shifted under him. He was seized. Some accounts say it was sudden. Others imply it was always the plan. A trap baited with courtesy. Either way, the result was the same. The ruler of Carcassonne became a prisoner. No dramatic battlefield defeat. No heroic last stand. Just a young lord, taken in a moment, because he walked into the wrong tent with the wrong faith in honor. His captors didn't need to parade him through the streets. The humiliation was deeper than that. They placed him in confinement, reported by tradition as in the very fortress that had been his symbol. A lord locked inside his own stone. Outside, the city felt the shock like a physical blow. Because once their viscount was captured, everything changed.
Hope became a rumor.
Carcassonne's defenders realized their leader could not command, could not rally, could not negotiate freely. The crusade now spoke with the only language it respected:
submission.
The terms for the city hardened. Not a noble surrender with honors. Not a respectful withdrawal.
A stripping.
Inhabitants were forced to leave.
Not as citizens. As displaced bodies.
They would be expelled with what they could carry. A human river pushed out from the walls, watched by armed men, leaving behind homes, workshops, churches, memories. Carcassonne didn't just lose a siege. It lost continuity. The crusade wasn't only changing rulers. It was changing who belonged. And Raymond-Roger in captivity became more than a prisoner. He became a symbol to be erased. Because as long as he lived, he could return. He could rally the South. He could become a banner of resistance. His imprisonment was a slow-motion execution. Days turned to weeks. Outside the cell, his lands were carved up in negotiations he could not attend.
Titles reassigned.
Loyal men pressured into new oaths. And the man who benefited most from this new order was Simon de Montfort, a northern noble whose name would become synonymous with conquest in the south. Raymond-Roger's humiliation wasn't loud. That's what makes it cinematic. A young ruler, trapped in silence, while the world he inherited is handed to a stranger. Then came the final cruelty. Raymond-Roger died in captivity in late 1209. Rumors spread immediately.
Illness, they said. Dysentery, they claimed.
Others whispered poison. History cannot certify the method with absolute certainty. But the timing spoke loudly enough. He died when he was most inconvenient alive. And the message to the south was unmistakable. Your lords can vanish behind a handshake. Your cities can be emptied without a battle. Your future can be reassigned with a papal blessing. The crusade had learned something from Béziers. Terror doesn't only kill people. It breaks the idea that resistance is possible. And once that idea breaks, the rest is paperwork. But Béziers remained the loudest moment. The original scream. Carcassonne's surrender was devastating. Raymond-Roger's capture was humiliating. His death was chilling. Yet none of it would have worked without the event that came first. The morning when an entire city became the sacrifice that bought obedience. The massacre that shook medieval Europe. Not because violence was rare, but because this violence was framed as holy. And that meant it could be repeated without remorse. The execution of Béziers didn't happen on a scaffold.
It happened in sunlight.
July 22, 1209. The city woke to an army outside its walls and a demand inside its ears. Deliver the heretics.
Prove your loyalty. Open the gates.
Béziers refused.
Maybe out of principle. Maybe out of pride.
Maybe out of the simple human fact that once you start handing over neighbors, you never stop. The crusaders waited like hunters. Inside the camp were men who believed they were God's instrument. And men who knew they were simply getting rich. That combination is one of history's most lethal mixtures. As the day began, there was movement near the walls. An exchange of taunts, a small clash, a surge of defenders trying to push the enemy back. Then came the moment that ruined everything.
A breach. A gate compromised.
And suddenly discipline was irrelevant. The crusaders flooded into Béziers with the speed of a dam breaking. The defenders could not form lines fast enough. The narrow streets became funnels. The city's own design turned against it.
Panic multiplied.
People ran toward the Church of the Madeleine and other sanctuaries. Because for centuries, churches were supposed to be the one place violence paused.
But crusades do not pause.
Not when the attackers believe heaven is watching. The invaders didn't have lists of Cathars. They didn't have time to interrogate.
They didn't want to sort.
In the noise, every face looked guilty. Every locked door looked like defiance. Every scream sounded the same. This is what made Béziers different from so many medieval slaughters.
It wasn't an accident.
It wasn't a brawl that spiraled. It was allowed. Leadership either couldn't stop it, or didn't want to. And when violence is permitted, it becomes contagious. Béziers became a moving storm of footsteps, splintering wood, shouted prayers, and the crackle of fire.
Buildings burned. Smoke swallowed streets.
People who had never held a weapon were treated like enemies of God. The city that had refused to divide itself was divided anyway. Not into Catholic and Cathar, but into living and dead. Into the spared and the erased. By the end, Béziers was a ruin with a name. Medieval chroniclers reported staggering numbers.
Tens of thousands.
Modern historians debate the exact count, because medieval numbers often carried symbolism as much as precision. But that debate misses the point. Whether it was 5,000 or 20,000, the effect was identical. Europe heard, a city fell, and no one was spared. That was the Crusades' true victory.
Not territory. Reputation.
Because after Béziers, the South didn't just fear defeat. It feared extermination. And fear is a faster siege engine than any tower. The massacre echoed beyond Occitania. It told every noble watching from afar that religious accusation could become a weapon of total war. That a label, heretic, could strip you of protection civilization pretended were universal. It also revealed something uncomfortable about medieval power. The church did not need to directly wield a sword to cause slaughter. It needed only to sanctify the men who did. The Albigensian Crusade continued for years after Béziers.
More sieges. More burnings.
More land transfers disguised as spiritual correction. Simon de Montfort expanded his control. The northern crown grew more interested. The South's independence began to suffocate under new rulers and new laws. And the Cathars, those quiet dissenters whose existence sparked the crusade, were hunted systematically afterward, driven into hiding, into fortresses, into eventual collapse. Béziers became the opening statement. A sentence written not with ink, but with a city. And hovering above the story is that infamous phrase. Whether perfectly authentic or sharpened by retelling. A phrase that survived because it captured the truth of the day.
Kill them all.
God will know his own. It is terrifying because it removes responsibility. It turns murder into administration. It turns uncertainty into permission. It turns faith into a mask that makes any cruelty look clean. Béziers wasn't just a massacre. It was a method. And once a method works, it spreads. Béziers did not die in darkness. It died in public. That's what made it shake medieval Europe. Medieval life was violent.
Wars were common.
Executions were entertainment. But Béziers carried a different kind of horror. The horror of total punishment. Because the massacre wasn't aimed at an army. It was aimed at a population. It wasn't designed to win a battle. It was designed to end the argument. After Béziers, every negotiation across the South took place in the shadow of a single question. If we refuse, will we be erased? That is how terror operates at the scale of history. It doesn't need to repeat itself everywhere. It only needs one unforgettable example. And Béziers was unforgettable. Think about what it did to the mind of the region. In one day, the rules people trusted were revealed as fragile theater.
Church sanctuary, conditional. Noble honor, negotiable.
The idea that innocence offers protection? Laughable, once the crowd decides labels matter more than faces. The Crusades' leaders could present the massacre as righteous cleansing. They could claim it was unfortunate necessity. They could wrap it in scripture and call it medicine. But the political outcome was clearer than any sermon. Béziers softened the South for conquest. Carcassonne fell soon after. Raymond-Roger Trencavel vanished into a cell and died. And the lands that had resisted northern control began to transfer, piece by piece, into different hands. Not always by battle.
By fear.
By oaths signed with trembling fingers. By nobles choosing surrender over annihilation. It also marked a turning point in how Europe could treat its own people. Crusade had once meant distant enemies. Foreign languages.
Different gods.
Béziers proved something that should have been impossible. A crusade could be turned inward.
Christian against Christian. Neighbor against neighbor.
And once that boundary breaks, violence becomes easier to justify forever. Because if heretic can mean anyone in the way, then anyone can be killed with clean conscience. That is Béziers' real legacy. Not just a number. Not just ruins.
A precedent.
A template that later centuries would recognize instantly. Accuse, dehumanize, surround, demand surrender, punish everyone, call it justice. And maybe the most haunting part is this. Béziers wasn't destroyed because every person inside held forbidden beliefs. It was destroyed because it refused to hand people over. It refused to become its own police state. It refused to tear itself apart to prove loyalty to an outside power. That choice, morally admirable, politically disastrous, became its death sentence. And the men who marched away from Béziers didn't just carry loot. They carried a new confidence. That they could do this again. That heaven would not stop them. That history might even praise them. Raymond-Roger Trencavel's story deepens the tragedy. He didn't die in a grand duel. He didn't lose a legendary last battle. He died as many real victims of power die. Caught between forces too large, betrayed by the idea that rules still mattered, erased quietly once he became inconvenient. His youth makes it worse. Because it reminds you that this wasn't an ancient, hardened tyrant being toppled. This was a young ruler trying to hold together a complicated society. In a century that demanded simplicity at sword point. And the city of Béziers, full of ordinary lives, paid the price for that century's hunger. Today, the stones are still there. The region is still beautiful. Tourists walk streets that were once choked with smoke. And time does what it always does. It smooths the edges. It turns screams into dates. It turns terror into paragraphs. But Béziers resists being softened. Because its story asks a question that is not medieval at all.
It is modern. It is permanent.
What happens when institutions decide that uncertainty is unacceptable? And that the easiest solution is to destroy everyone who complicates the narrative? Béziers shows the endpoint.
Not persuasion. Not debate. Not even conquest. Erasure.
So here's the question that still hangs in the air, heavy as smoke over a burning city. If an army came to your walls demanding you surrender your neighbors, and promised mercy only if you helped them choose who deserves to live, would you open the gate? Or would you keep it closed, knowing exactly what example means?